I was thinking about this, and we saw that the topic is cloud transforming businesses. And I realized this cloud thing is at least 20 odd years old. You know, Salesforce.com came around about 1999. We all did this. Will it work? Is it sticky? Is it secure? Et cetera, et cetera. But maybe we could go around the table, and I'm going to ask one simple question to set it up, which is, to what extent do you think is cloud really transforming organizations based on your own experience or previous experiences? So maybe we could start on left-hand side with John O'Donovan.
So I suppose you've got to ask the right question. So what would you be transforming by using the cloud? So I've been using the cloud in various companies in the last 10, maybe might be even slightly longer years. It doesn't have any magical qualities in the way it allows you to create services. So I think you have to think about what problem you're trying to solve. So for example, if you take an existing infrastructure which is in a bit of a mess and you put it into the cloud, it will still be a bit of a mess unless you sort it out while you're doing that journey. But I think it's also, I've gone there and back, so it's another tool in my armory, I guess. So you have to decide what things, it's maybe not even a cloud conversation, it's more about what things do you want to run yourself and build yourself, and what things do you not want to run yourself. So is it a line of business thing? Is it important to you as a business that you own and run everything? Are there security issues you have to consider, or what matters in that equation? And I think it's a more evolved question now. So it's not that you're going to install cloud and suddenly everything's good. You've got to think about why you're doing it and what are you doing it for, and you have to think about the different cost models, which is maybe something we should talk about in finance, and how that changes that model. So I'm sort of in a different place. I'm sort of beyond an immediate cloud journey. I'm not quite coming back, but I'm also thinking about why do I want to do it? What's the reason for it? And making sure you fully understand that question.
Exactly. And Juan?
So I think to the point you were making, we have to be very clear as to what do we mean by cloud, because there's lots of different flavors of cloud. Whether we mean software as a service or infrastructure and platform as a service. For us, it's certainly helping us transform how we think of building new products and services and how we serve the citizens. So it's a big enabler for us. It gives us a lot more agility, a lot more flexibility in terms of how we think and how we're able to build those products and services. But to your point, you're absolutely 100% right. If you're going to do IT like you've always done IT, then the conversation becomes lost, because the cloud is about new ways of delivering products, services, and how you think of addressing that market. So it's quite a complex answer. It's not a very simple answer to give you here. No one size fits all, absolutely.
Christelle?
Just to pick up on your point, what do we actually mean by cloud? It's a very, very broad term. But certainly if I think about software as a service, it's transforming the way people work, and it's an inevitability really. A lot of systems are moving to the cloud because that is what's dictated by the vendors. And certainly from an end user perspective, I think they can access their data more readily, they can collaborate more effectively. So from that perspective, just thinking about the end user and less about what we do behind the scenes in our IT departments, absolutely, I think it's transforming the way people work.
Yeah, absolutely. And Emma?
So it's interesting actually, because I obviously get to see it from a different perspective across multiple industries. And one of the interesting stats that just came out from one of our analysts was that 90% of companies at the moment have a cloud strategy and have adopted cloud in some sense or form. Back to your point, what is cloud? But what was the more interesting stat was that actually 60% of those that have adopted cloud have found they haven't realised the business value that they originally intended to do. So I think what we've seen is a bit of an evolution from, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago, where it's very much a cloud-first strategy to move on to the cloud. Now, exactly to all of your points, it's really more around looking at what's the business value that we want to unlock, what's the business problem we want to solve. And I think the vendors and the cloud capabilities that actually solve that problem is really where we're going to see it moving next.
Excellent. Graeme?
So Martin, you said cloud has been around for 20 years, but for us at Williams, it's been a 5-year journey. So I still have the battle scars. And in fact, 5 years ago, to this day, we were moving into Office 365 and giving people a cloud mailbox, and I know what the reasons for doing it were. It was mobility, it was collaboration, and it was giving us an elastic capability where we can't afford to fund all of the compute power that's needed for the whole year when you only need it for 3 months. And so that's what the cloud offered us. And to what Emma just said, I never justified it on the basis of it was going to reduce any of our costs. It was going to be much more flexible, but it certainly wasn't going to reduce our costs.
And it's definitely not the thing to lead with because
it's not cheaper.
And if you use it wrong, it can be more expensive.
Yeah.
If you don't switch things off or you lazily fire things up in the cloud and then let them run forever, then they're charging you every single month. There's no asset to sweat.
And it wasn't as easy to shut them down as the vendors claimed at the beginning, right?
But I absolutely take your point on that. I think you need to have some clear governance in place around how you use these cloud services to avoid those hidden charges, because sometimes they just creep up on you.
It's interesting actually, because one of the trends we're seeing as well is obviously when you look at it, to your point, from a commercial and financial perspective, we're moving away from the traditional commercial setup, and it's a lot more looking at actually the tooling that supports usage, so you understand who needs to use it, when they need to use it, how they need to use it, and a lot of the commercial constructs are very much usage based now, which is very different from where we were even, as you say, sort of 2-3 years ago.
But where you have bursty models, so there are certain times when you need enormous capacity. Now you don't need that all the time, so when you're building your fixed infrastructure and you're building it to cope with a peak, then in industries I've worked in before, so especially in media, your peak can be 1,000 times your average, so suddenly you've got to build to 1,000 times more than what you need most of the time. So you have to that becomes a consideration then in how you build that service. So how can you draw on that when you need it, and how do you make sure that you switch it off again when you don't? So there are ways of managing things, but it's an extra consideration in how you build and manage services. So and it is a managing thing. You have to make sure you don't just build things and leave them anymore. You have to be on top of how you're managing it going forward.
You do have to give up some of the control, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. There's a lot of upside to cloud, and I'm glad that we took that journey, but cloud vendors tend to do their upgrades on a weekend. Most organizations these days are not Monday to Friday, but certainly for a Formula One team, we're racing on a weekend and we're in different time zones. So 2 a.m. in the UK is irrelevant because that's actually the car is out on the track somewhere in the world.
That's
so
really interesting.
We've struggled with that a bit, with things being changed where we would never have planned downtime, and we don't. Any on-premise systems are not touched on a race weekend. The cloud vendors don't, and they don't always notify you when they're changing things. And sometimes when they change something, it breaks. We have a fault system that we run on an online cloud system that they absolutely need for the running of the car on a race weekend. And every now and then the vendor changes something in that breaks the workflow, and so that's been a frustration with cloud. There is a downside, and that's probably the only downside we've found, other than the costs are, creep up as you go along.
But your point about control, I think, is a very interesting one. I think as we go on this journey where more and more things become cloud enabled, certainly those people within an IT department who've traditionally managed their own network and had full control, certainly in my experience can sometimes feel a little nervous about that loss of control, and it's almost like something that they don't understand as much, and therefore sometimes you need to watch out for those people in an organisation, because I think they need to be managed and they need to be brought on the journey. Otherwise, I think they can constrain the progress.
It's interesting actually, because when I talk to the cloud providers and sort of back on the stat of that people haven't really realised the cloud value, but also struggling to actually make it on that cloud journey. A lot of the number one reason that they actually say to us is very much around the cultural transformation. So not just that it's winning the hearts and minds, but then there's the next step of actually, I think you made the point as well, where you can't stay the same. If you're really going to take advantage of cloud, you actually need to have an agile organisation. You need a different operating model. Otherwise, really, if you just move the workload to the cloud, you really just move to someone else's data centre. You're not releasing that value.
I was warned before we did our cloud journey that you have to change the people or change the people. So it was either your people are going to have to adapt, and instead of ordering a box, taking it out, rack mounting it, and if that's what they love to do, they're going to struggle with cloud. And so that really troubled me, because I had a good group of people, and I didn't want to be losing people. But actually, there were some who just couldn't make that change.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's getting harder as well, though, because people are adopting a multi-cloud environment. So you've got different cloud vendors, and therefore you need different skills. So it not just retraining, but then retraining multiple times, etc. And it is a challenge.
So we went for one vendor initially to reduce that issue, and then of course they see that you're locked in, and so the price starts to climb, and you have to then have a multi-vendor approach, and that adds complexity and difficulty.
Yeah.
It's very interesting listening to you guys, and of course there's the conversation can take many different directions. We have in DWP a strategy around cloud and the use of cloud, but what we do as a department isn't cloud. We build products and services that serve the citizen, and how we do that now, we have a set of tools at our disposal, and cloud is one of those phenomenal tools that we will use when appropriate. So it has to be, to your point, it has to be appropriate for that, and it gives us tremendous value. We host a whole bunch of workloads in the cloud, and we get tremendous value out of hosting those workloads in the cloud. And we develop dev test and all the pre-prod work that we do. We can do that in the cloud as well, taking phenomenal amount of cost out of developing those products. We may still deploy into the cloud, or we'll deploy into our own data centers. And those choices we're able to make now and bring agility. The single biggest challenge we have isn't the cost of cloud or the things that we've been talking about, is the mindset in the organization, and the challenge we have with talent and capability across the organization. Because the mindset for us was one where we always hosted everything. We've built this great big monolithic products and services. We always worked, IT always worked in a silo. We were a proxy for the business between the business and the supplier community, and that has changed now, and we have a whole bunch of other opportunities. So if I can go software as a service, I will always prefer that. Why build something that somebody else has built and is really good at managing and supporting? If I can then build something using infrastructure and platform as a service, then why bother, why concern myself? They're great at delivering that infrastructure and those controls, and the shared responsibility model works really, really well for us. But sometimes that doesn't work, so I've got to consider that as well.
Yeah, I think cloud brought enormous benefit for us. I say collaboration. We have people all over the world working seamlessly as if they were sitting next to in an office next to each other. The whole mobility piece, they can now do their job no matter where they are, and cloud was absolutely an enabler for that. We can, on a race weekend, someone can be standing in their kitchen talking to someone on the other side of the world in near real time, having a natural conversation, and that's just incredible, and just added more and more brains to the problem.
What I would say though is I think the whole move of, especially going back to software as a service, lots of people will be sat in businesses thinking, well, I don't actually need IT anymore because I'm just going to sign up for this piece of software. So I think the whole nature of what the value we add as an IT department is changing, and it's not a case of, well, I don't need you anymore because you don't have to install this on my server.
I agree. I think it's the exact opposite, because and the trends, and just listening, obviously people going the same trends in terms of multi-cloud, hybrid cloud environment. In order to unlock the value that you need, you effectively are having to have a skilled department that is more able to cope, because as you've highlighted, you've got the benefits of having multi-cloud are that you're able to take advantage of I suppose more cost competitive deals, and then you haven't got the reliance issues of one specific cloud vendor over another. The downside is, in order to unlock the value, you have to have a really good environment that can cope with that interoperability. And if you haven't got an organisation that can actually bring it all together, you almost hinder the original value that you would have had with cloud by effectively unlocking that.
So I've got a very simple view. I mean, I was going to say fools when you say, because it makes no sense whatsoever. If any business out there thinks that, oh, we don't need an IT department, we can go software as a service, they're delusional, they're just not going to deliver any outcome. Tell me who they are, because I certainly don't want to work for them, because there's no software as a service that will exist on their own. So it's not just about Office 365, Salesforce, Workday, ServiceNow, whatever that is, there's a whole bunch of things there. Still needs to integrate back into the enterprise. You still need to deliver enterprise class service, whether it's GDPR, security, other things. So it's the challenge for us is in the department isn't that that's going to happen and you're going to get that shadow or business-led IT, which always happen, whatever language you want to use. The challenge is that as IT, we now have an opportunity to sit with the enterprise and co-create, ideate, all that design thinking, and helping deliver great value out of the organization. So no longer is somebody that sits on the side that takes a set of requirements, matured, and all those kinds of things that we used to do years ago. Now it's together, how do we address the challenges of the marketplace, and how do we use the capability that IT has and the experience that we have as technologists with the experience of the business to really differentiate, to really compete, and to really add value. The cloud is one of those things that's going to help us.
And do you feel, Juan, that it's really enabled CIOs or IT leaders to do what they were always wanted to do by the board, which was come up with competitive differentiation, service, data that provides insights, and worry less about the day-to-day plumbing of the role? Do you think the role has changed significantly?
Yes, I think as a CIO, as a CTO nowadays, you have to not only be a technologist, but you also have to be in tune with the business as well there. And you're there to support the business with technology to really compete and differentiate. And that's the value. The market out there is changing continuously, it's moving, and you're there to help bring that agility back into the business. And if you can't do that, then you're then making yourself irrelevant, but you're also not doing the role that you should be doing.
If you look at the mistakes of the past, I suppose, the last thing you should be doing is walking around with a hammer, just looking for every nail you can hit to solve the same way. Because there are certain things I won't do in the cloud, and certain restrictions I have also mean I can't anyway. So I think that that creates a much more interesting conversation. So how do you solve those problems in the real world, where you actually do need a kit of parts, and you need to be able to build something which can work, let's call it on-premise. I mean, it's interesting when you talk about on-premise, because I imagine none of us own their own data center, so it's not like funny enough, we have got one in the building, but that's not really a data center as such. But it's, we do have some capability, but it's not, it's not like we're choosing to put things in our data center or the cloud. It's not quite as simple as that. It's a much more nuanced argument about, well, where is the data center, who runs it, who owns it, how do you look at your arrangements there. So you need to think about what's the right tool for the right job, and those tools are changing rapidly, so you have to be very comfortable with the change that could happen, because if you're only pointed in one direction, and even with the cloud providers, now they're finally listening in that, okay, it's not about being all in with the cloud, because for some organizations that's not the answer, and it can't be. But it's providing services which you can run in your data center, which give you the same benefits of the cloud. So they give you that elastic capability, they're easy to run, they're simple to deploy, and you can call them off as needed, but they're standard, essentially edge type services, or things which you can install or manage globally, which mean maybe you can still have your own infrastructure and have that managed in a different way. Because if you really think about it, if your data center ran like the cloud, well, would you want the cloud anyway? Because it's just because that model wasn't provided. So that elastic capability was something, and it's not just the elastic capability, it's the additional features that have been built around it. So it's not just about being able to fire up servers. I mean, there's facilities and services which are provided, which traditionally have only been available in the cloud. Now, as those move out of the cloud, and there are some suppliers have really understood this and started to build services which you can install, which take advantage of all that, then that changes the equation again. I think that now that's a much more stable model. So now it's a healthy conversation about what is the best way to do it. So
I'll say the word you didn't want to say, hybrid cloud.
No, you said it.
I try and avoid using that
I
at all.
realise that.
You
but
saw me
that's what
tiptoeing around it, yeah.
That's what you described. That's what we've tried to do, build a hybrid cloud way.
We've done a review. 60% of the businesses are actually going for a hybrid cloud model, hybrid multi-cloud model as well. And it is because, exactly to your point, that I think the original principle was to almost the lift and shift model. If you move your applications to someone else's data center, you're not going to realise the value that you originally intended to. It's more around, to your point, what do you need to put in the cloud, what makes sense to put in the cloud, but also not just putting it lift and shift. You're actually looking at the modernisation side of things. Can you actually just look at workloads and take advantage of some of the cloud services? So you're not really just lifting and shift, you're actually re-engineering modernisation, and it makes a big difference. And having a more appropriate strategy, what we found is those that have that then realise the most value.
So we run to state-of-the-art data centers. We have a very mixed machine environment. There are workloads which are just not suitable for the cloud, maybe now, maybe never in the future.
Because of the performance or because of regulation? What do you...
No, so we have mainframes, we have mid-range, we have a whole host of things. There's a lot of other reasons, could be security, proximity to the data, all kinds of reasons. So we've built, we were completely outsourced, and the journey that I plotted through meant that we built 2 brand new data centers and moved those workloads there. As we're rethinking how we serve the citizen and the tools that we give our agents, our 84,000 colleagues, how we give them tools to serve those citizens better, and we're reinventing all of those processes and reinventing how we do business, then the cloud is an incredible tool. Managing a data center is incredibly complex, it's very, very painful, and if I could place everything in a cloud-like type of environment, I would do that, because I'm managing facilities, I'm managing infrastructure, environmentals, and every time I need to get the point on agility and flexibility, and there's lots of tools that you can deploy, but those guys do it for real, and they do it on a day-to-day basis, and no matter how many tools I deploy and how much instrumentation I give my data center, I am never going to get the flexibility and the agility that I'm going to get with cloud. And every time I've just sat on a call, we need to do a storage expansion, and I need to think to build a business case. Why do I need a business case? I need more storage. What the heck? You know what I mean? It's like, whilst in cloud, I remove all of those constraints and all of those things that I do. So there's a lot of costs there as well in managing those things. Of course, AWS, Azure, Microsoft, all of those guys are there to make money, but they take a lot of those pains away from us. So they manage the facilities, they manage the environments, they manage the team. They give me the agility and the flexibility to expand.
It's interesting, isn't it? As I said, it's around about 20 years, say, that some people set off very early on the journey. It was interesting at the time, I remember, the old guard would say, oh, it's time sharing, mainframe time sharing again. The cloud people would say, oh, these are a bunch of server huggers. It was got very nasty in the cloud wars, I tell you, much more than many others. But now we have a more mature attitude, don't we? We're a lot of people are cloud first, except where it doesn't make sense, and it's a lot more pragmatic now, right? Is that the general feeling around the table? And what do you feel needs to mature more, either on your side or the vendor side or the technology side? Anything?
I think what's interesting is maybe not about the cloud, it's actually how you change your cost model. So. So in its simple terms, again in most businesses, so you're moving from a model of saying, well, there are fixed assets which are then sweat for a number of years through to you're now leasing your capacity, and you have to fundamentally understand what that means, because it's a very different model. It might move you from a CapEx model to a different type of model, and that can fundamentally shoot your business case out of the sky if you're not clear about how you're going to explain that to the rest of the business. And I think that is that's a fundamental issue to try and understand, because the last thing that finance directors found, as I found over many years, is they hate surprises. You don't want to go in and say, turns out that cloud build's going to be a bit bigger. You just don't want that. So you need to be very aware of how you're looking at that change and what it might mean for you.
But I think with any change in technology, there needs to be a business case. It's all very well to say, let's just move everything to the cloud. There has to be a compelling reason. It has to make sense financially, operationally. It's a bit naive just to walk into an organisation and say, right, we need to be cloud first, 100%.
Yeah, I agree, and that's what we say. It's a lot more. It's got to solve a business problem, and to your point, I think the evolution has to happen on all sides, because I think cloud providers out there, obviously we're seeing more evolution on a day-to-day basis, and effectively I think that the playing field's been slightly levelled, and I think those that will win it are those that can actually answer specific business solutions and problems. And from a converse perspective, if you don't answer it from an outcome perspective, I don't think you're not going to adopt it.
There is that element, isn't it? The early on, there's forklift upgrades or the lift and shift type upgrades. They were a little bit, as they used to say about outsourcing, your mess for less. And maybe it's not even going to be less in the end either. But there was that feeling of get it out of my domain for some of the nastier jobs. Let me ask you though, there was an element, and you touched on it, I think, John, that it's not the only reason it came in, but it certainly was an enabler for nasties such as bill shock, as you said. You hadn't realized you're running all these instances and it's all added up, or adding all of these seats and not shutting them down when you're not using. And the other one I would say is, I think you mentioned it, shadow IT, where all of a sudden the lunatics were taking over the asylum, and all of the lines of business were slamming things on credit cards. And that became very difficult, I think, for many CIOs to handle. Do you agree, disagree?
I suppose you have to understand why that might have happened in the first place. So as a technologist, you have to be constantly thinking about what you're being asked to achieve, what objectives you're trying to understand, and be very much part of that conversation. You don't want to be external to that. You want to understand why we're trying to do this and being able to find a quick solution to it, because some of these things happen because you don't have an alternative answer, or you're not quick enough with an alternative answer. So you need to be very aware of heading off these conversations. So then you can have a much more considerate way of looking at what's the right way to build it. So rather than being presented with something which feels like a fait accompli that hasn't been considered in the round. Some things actually can look cheap, and then year 3 it turns out it's not cheap, and that can happen in any type of contract. So I think it's how you, I guess how you make sure. Maybe IT directors don't like surprises either. I mean, it's just how you find the right way to understand what is the business actually trying to achieve.
I think it's a challenge as well. I mean, we've talked through the cycle of where we've gone from single cloud to multi-cloud, and I think the challenge is that ultimately, what you're describing, we're seeing 70% are going to adopt a multi-cloud hybrid environment, but ironically, when you look at it, and actually only probably 30% actually have a true hybrid multi-cloud strategy. And if you don't have the strategy, it's going to make it very challenging for you to, as you say, sort of make the right decisions. And I think it's very difficult because people think, I've got my strategy, here it is, and then you dust it off, it is from 2 years ago. And I think ultimately these days your strategy needs to be re-evaluated on almost a kind of monthly basis, and look at the vendors' roadmaps, where they're going from, where your investments are, etc. So that's why I say it's more complex of a job these days.
One of my war wounds is that whenever you get a quote for a cloud server, it's always the lowest level server. So you budget on that basis, and then once you start using it and the database grows, or you need a higher spec server, and it's always double the every time I go up, the stack seems to double the price, the monthly price of a server. And so a lot of the costing that we did originally was blown out of the water within 12 months once you actually started using the system.
Software licensing sometimes as well, database licensing. Or
I think we certainly can't assume that the sole reason you would move to the cloud is to save money.
No.
Absolutely not. If you look at Arsenal, we have a huge stadium, so we have some of our servers on-prem because actually we don't pay for the space because we own it. So that's a significant component of the cost just to start with. So you just have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, in my view.
I think it's also not how to get to the cloud and why you're getting to the cloud, but it's almost what you do when you're there. It's that unlocking the value. I mean, what we're seeing is that, and ironically, sometimes the reason why companies actually went to the cloud isn't the value that they then ultimately achieve. So being able to, all the analytics that you can get from relevant data that you weren't able to unlock before, and also new services that a number of the cloud vendors almost out of the box. I I mean, even just last week, the data in terms of 40% of the Black Friday sales were now done online and on mobile devices, which was unheard of from before. So all of the cloud vendors that were able to provide out of the box mobile sales platforms ultimately will release and unlock that value almost immediately. And I think it's things like that and what you do next after you've got to the cloud that I think that's where the next challenge is going to be.
John mentioned sweating assets, and I think one of the benefits of cloud is that you don't end up on aging hardware that you can't afford to upgrade, and then the services become not fit for purpose. One of the real benefits that we've seen is that we're able to stay current and we're able to adapt very quickly. The first time I saw an IT person interacting with an aerodynamicist who'd asked for a database server, and instead of being told it'll be 6 weeks to order the hardware and licenses, they were given a monthly price and we can have it up and running in 2 hours. And I knew that's when our cloud strategy was the right one.
Absolutely. I mean, procurement is one of the big obstacles that's been left. Let me ask just very briefly, though, because I think you're all in violent agreement on this topic, that it's not about cost savings. But,
so you're going to try and divide us now?
Well, I'll do my best, But I remember very early in the days of cloud, certainly, whatever people said publicly, there was a feeling as well that there was a fundamental cost saving. Do you feel, you might want to admit that whether you ever felt like that, or that you were always on the side of the angels and you never felt like that? But when you think about the economics of cloud now, how does that work out for you, leaving aside some of the intangibles such as cost of opportunity and ability to move faster and so on? Has the economics of cloud computing surprised you at all or changed in ways that you've noticed?
So I find that when we've done a number of business cases, it's you have to be very specific. So I think everyone's, again, violently in agreement on this one, that if you move your whole IT infrastructure to the cloud, you're probably not going to make on the face of it going to make a cost saving, but you're going to realise a number of the other benefits we've mentioned in terms of resilience and agility, etc. However, if you move key components to the cloud, and I think somebody mentioned test environments, etc., that then ones that are very cyclical or have peaks and troughs in terms of requirements, there are actually business cases out there that do make it more cost effective. And I'm sure the example you gave of the time it takes for the people in your organisation to wait for the infrastructure, that's a cost in itself. So I think it's just, again, rather than looking at it in its entirety, you need to look at it on the business value of specific points.
I guess what is the cost of not moving quickly to support your business's aspirations? I think that's the issue.
Okay.
So when I look at DWP, cloud itself and the use of cloud has brought significant cost savings to us, as well as a whole host of other benefits and value into the organization. So there's, that doesn't hold true for us. The cloud is more expensive. It certainly isn't. It's helped us reduce the cost of hosting our services and our infrastructure by way more than 50%. So very, very significant. We operate a large estate. And maybe we're different in that context because of the size and scale at which we operate. So cloud has given us not only a significant cost saving, but it also released those savings for us to bring a lot more agility into how we then build products and services. So for us, cloud isn't about a server. It's never about a server. For us, cloud, it's about an outcome that we're trying to deliver. And when we were exiting our hosting and our outsourcing contracts and disaggregating those contracts, there was this thing in government, it's cloud first and you've got to take everything to cloud. I said, no, we're not taking everything to cloud. We're going to take the things that will certainly make us and deliver a difference for us, and we're going to use cloud appropriately to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve as a department. And that's really very important. So if you get it can become very simple. Oh, everything has to go to the cloud. No, we want to use cloud appropriately to deliver the outcome that we talked through. So if it's software as a service, fantastic. We use a lot of software as a services. We also build a lot of our products and services. So you can imagine we universal credit and all of those things that we do. You can't just go and buy it as a software as a service. And we host that in cloud. We also host a lot of our data and a lot of our dependent systems and infrastructure on our on-premise network. And it's you need to think through how all of those things are going to come together to achieve the outcome that you're looking for.
That's going to be the next challenge. So I always get asked, okay, this was the challenge, okay, we've got to address that. But the next challenge, I think, is really going to be, dare I say it, we always talked about siloed organisations. I think it's going to be cloud silos now, because there are so many different opportunities from different vendors, software as a service versus, more of the cloud platform providers. Is making them work together, because you're still one organisation that still needs to achieve, key specific outcomes. But if you can't get those to work together, and I think you mentioned it, if you look at even just the migration tools and the capabilities you need to actually move things onto the cloud are very different depending on what cloud you're talking about. So I think being able to understand how that interoperability works between the different cloud silos is really going to be the next way.
So for me, one big risk of using cloud isn't really cost, it's effectively vendor locking. And part of my job is to orchestrate and make sure that doesn't happen in as much as we possibly can, by making sure as we're building those products and those services, we do it in a standard way as we possibly can. Because when we look at, especially around infrastructure and platform as a service, if I look at AWS or Azure, they're not just offering basic hosting and virtualization, they're offering 4,000 or 5,000 other products and services that make your life a lot easier as a developer. If you then take 2 or 3 techies in a room, you'll get 4 or 5 different opinions as to how you need to do those things. So your job as a technologist is to orchestrate and manage all of that, because if you the risk for me is then ending up in a lock-in state, and the future can be grim from there on.
I mean, it changes the conversation, though. So what are you actually trying to achieve? So yes. I don't really want servers, because servers don't do anything. It's and that's actually moving the conversation more into the terms of, well, neither does the rest of the business. The rest of the business doesn't either. They're trying to run services, or they're trying to, yes. If you take it down to a simple level, developers just want to run code. They don't care where it runs. So I think it's how you not think about cloud, but think about if all of your provisioning was done through as simple an interface as the cloud providers give you, so you tick a box if you want something, and then you have a different conversation with your own infrastructure provider, and that tends to be a longer conversation at the best of times. So there's no reason why that has to be. So you can take that model and say, this is how I want it to work. And one of the things which I've done in the past, which is quite a long time ago, not quite hybrid again, but it was, you could choose where do you want to put the server. You can put it here, or you can put it in the cloud. But you have a choice, and there weren't many limitations on you choosing which place you wanted to put it. And now when you also then start thinking about serverless environments, then again that changes the conversation completely, because then you really are just running a service, and that actually is quite an empowering thing. You're now talking at the same level as probably the rest of your company, is how they understand Absolutely. Things. I want to run this thing. Absolutely. So I want to run it here, and I want it in 15 different locations around the globe. So
wrinkles that remain. I'm thinking about access to talent. I'm thinking about managing multiple clouds, where you might want to swap workloads between different clouds that have different advantages. And you mentioned lock-in, the risk that if you do have all of your eggs, or a lot of your eggs, in one basket, then you risk repeating what happened to companies that had IBM in the 1970s or Microsoft in the 2000s. Anyone want to pick up about the pain points that they really want to address in the near term with cloud to get all of those glorious competitive advantages?
I mean, I'd love to know if people have done the multi-vendor cloud well, because that's what I'm struggling with, finding the right broker, someone who can seamlessly switch you. So the dream always was, if Microsoft's cheaper today, then I'm running my services on Microsoft, and if AWS is cheaper tomorrow, then I'm running it there, and if Google's cheaper, and if there's some small provider in the UK who can, for whatever reason, beat the other 3, then I'm using them the day after. I just don't see that, and so we end up probably
Well, let's go
paying
to
more
Emma,
than
because
we
you
do.
talked a lot about multi-cloud.
Yeah.
Well, so this is, and ironically, that's what we're looking at from a technology perspective is brokerage across hybrid multi-cloud environments and looking at that. The one thing I would say is that it's not just a technology challenge, and I think we've said this before, is that all works for the solution side of things, but really the operating model that the businesses then run behind it needs to actually map to that. And I think the biggest challenge we're seeing is and hence the cloud providers come to us, their biggest issue in terms of moving workloads to the cloud is that change management, that cultural change. So we're looking at what we call a boundaryless operating model, because ultimately the reason people move to the cloud is because there are no boundaries. You've said already many examples of how you can actually move very quickly, and I think you've got to shift your traditional, almost dare I say, idle operating model to this more boundaryless operating model where those constraints, the approvals, all of the procurement side of things that you normally see just aren't there anymore.
So for us, there's a lot of moving parts to cloud, to your point, and the biggest challenge we have in delivering the vision that we have for the department is around talent and capability. So how do we develop our talent? How do we build capability across the department? And how do we attract talent, the talent that we can't develop? How do we attract it back into the department? And that's where we need to focus. Our challenge is around people. And the question of whether we're doing cloud well or not, the things that I measure suggest that we're doing really, really well, the things that matter. So running our services is costing us 50% less than it used to. We have a hybrid cloud infrastructure, multi-cloud providers, and it's costing us a lot less. Our service performance is better than it's ever been. So our uptime and our performance and our products and services are there to serve the citizen for longer than they've ever been. So our service lost hours, which is a big measure, it's world class right now. So, and it used to take us 6 months at least to work through a business case, and another 6 months to bring a server online through some suppliers into a data center. It takes us 5 minutes to do all of that, right? So all of that means that we can build great products, great services, bring flexibility to the business and adapt.
We've talked a lot about some of the wrinkles, that's pretty my fault, but in terms of great successes, lessons learned, even if you're really bold enough, what you wouldn't have done, could we go around the table and have a crack at that one, if we could? John?
The cloud just challenges you to do your job better, so, and that's a really healthy thing. So you do ask the question of, well, if it's this easy to do in the cloud, why can't I do it in my data center? And I think the thing that interests me now is, well, the services are now available to start doing this, so you can run containers and run them. I think that's probably why I'm sort of, again, not quite so interested in hybrid. I'm more interested in I want to be able to run applications and services where I want to run them in the way I want to run them and based on the restrictions I have. So I think that, but that actually is probably the best thing out of it. You get challenged to run your services better by working with people who do run them very well. Yeah. And I think that then filters through your entire organization, so you build things better, you maintain them better, because you don't want to see those weaknesses in the future. So I think that's the most important thing.
Absolutely. Juan?
So for me, it's not really about cloud. Cloud solves everything and solves nothing for us. It's really, how do I get with the business, sit at the same round table as the business and think through how we solve those things that are really important for the business, and how I then use the tools that I have at my disposal, of which cloud is one of those tools to really help the business achieve and deliver those outcomes in the best possible way. So, and in that context, I don't try to solve everything. I always focus on one little thing, one little bite of that elephant. It's really important that you take it in steps and build from that.
It's an arrow in your quiver. Christelle?
I totally agree with what you said there, and I always think about, how can technology enable the organisation I work in? Absolutely. But what I will say, I think we live in an increasingly complex world to a certain extent. We have more choice than we ever had before, right? Do I put it on-prem? Do I put it in that cloud or somebody else's cloud? So I think some of the things, and certainly a few people have mentioned it, but those sort of disciplines around your operating model, your people, the skills, the governance, I think that's a very, very important thing that we shouldn't lose sight of.
Absolutely.
I think for me, just coming from a technology background and very much working with people such as yourselves, what I like about cloud is it enables you to look at that end-to-end service, so work with the rest of the business and actually see what the business outcome is. I mean, it's that classic thing from when it's really enjoyable actually seeing what you achieved and something very tangible, and because it is more of a service-based provision now, that's great.
I think there's been a huge number of upsides. I know I've focused so far on on some of the war wounds, but genuinely our staff can work anywhere in the world at any time, have access to the data that they need at the right time. Sadly, we're at the back of the grid, so cloud, not cloud, that's irrelevant. It's just getting the data to them so that they can improve that car. And over the next couple of years, we want to see ourselves getting back to the front of the grid, and that's what we're focused on, rather than where should we put in this. But the mobility, the collaboration tools that we've put in place, the performance, it's more secure, it's more available than we could do with our own in-house server rooms, because they're not data centers. Going back to what John said earlier, so there's been huge upside to the cloud, but ultimately we're all focused on getting that Formula One car back up to the top of the grid.
Is there something we missed out that you'd like to say, anybody?
And I think security is one of the things you have to consider a lot. So when I think about making yourself better, so we haven't really touched on that, but there are things we've done. So things like bring your own key is actually a mechanism we've used where we do use the cloud to actually make it better than services were in the past. So it's not, we haven't just encrypted it, we've encrypted it with your key as a client, and if you decide, we can't even see the data because it's your key. So I think that those things give assurances around how are you managing and protecting information. And I think that's where you need to take full advantage of what mechanisms are available to you now. And I think those things help you figure out what you can run in the cloud and what you can't, but it does make it easier to work through some of these conversations with private and confidential data, which is it's a very big topic.
That's probably is the missing point, isn't it? Security, in that now you have to think about your supply chain a lot more. So if you know what you're doing with your technology on your network, and all of a sudden you are entrusting your data with multiple third parties, I think that's a whole different challenge.
And some of the big hacks recently have not been the organizations themselves, it's the supply chain. So it's something that we care very much about as we're allowing more and more either suppliers or customers into our network. It becomes a much more difficult challenge. But I mean, that's not necessarily cloud, non-cloud, that's just the challenge of managing the supply chain.
So one of the things we're looking at the moment is you almost don't know what you don't know. So I think when looking at an overall cloud strategy, we're sort of looking at almost the business case tools to do an analysis on your existing environment, be it hybrid, multi-cloud, etc., to understand actually what would be the right next move. Because I think you mentioned it, it's almost like you've got to have a reason to move. So we've invested in some new tooling which we called MyNav, which ultimately does that full analysis that goes, actually, this would be the next best thing for you to move to the cloud, etc., to understand that, because we've realised that if you don't have the business case that backs it up, as you rightly said, then there's not much point in moving. So I think having that data to support that will be really game changing.